The film begins by showing a man named Johnny who has just arrived at a certain place. Johnny is seen slowly entering the area on horseback and giving a signal to a local resident. Then Johnny, who is in front of the bank, checks the bullet casing he is carrying, which has the name Brett Clayton written on it, and Johnny says it won't be long now. Afterwards, Johnny took a short break at a bar located in the area. Not long after, Johnny saw two Indians being beaten and about to be raped, so he came to their aid and saved them. The villagers who found the sheriff lying helpless assumed he had been shot dead by Johnny. Furthermore, a mustachioed man arrived and revealed he knew about Johnny as he was a fugitive with a high bounty, whether captured dead or alive. Then Johnny, who was now in the detention cell, was able to release his handcuffed hands in front of the sheriff's. That's where Johnny explained that his arrival in the area was only to stop Brett Clayton, who turned out to be a big-time criminal who was going to break into the bank that Johnny had previously noticed. Sure enough, not long after, a resident reported to them that Brett's group had succeeded in robbing the bank that Johnny had previously mentioned. After they left, Johnny took out the watch he always carried with him, which contained a photo of his late father. The story then shifts to several years ago when Johnny was still a child. Johnny's father and mother were clearly seen performing in front of the residents, where Johnny's father managed to amaze the residents with his shooting skills.
Oh boy!
However, unbeknownst to them among the audience, Brett and his group were seen disapproving of Johnny's father named Bullseye putting on a show, and therefore Brett and his group planned to get rid of Bullseye. Back in the present, Johnny, who is about to be hanged, is given a few minutes to deliver a message or confess his sins. However, Johnny, who isn't particularly religious, orders the executioners to hurry up and execute him. It turned out that the help came from two Indians whom Johnny had helped the other day. They took Johnny to a place to thank him for saving them, and to repay his kindness, they gave Johnny a gun and a horse and told him to continue his journey. Unfortunately, halfway through his journey, Johnny encountered the sheriffs who were still chasing him to recapture him. Sometime later, Johnny, who was still on his journey, kept thinking about what Brett had said to his father, which reminded Johnny. At that time, Johnny and the local residents were listening to his father's sermon, as his father was also a reverend. There, his father advised Johnny that when he grew up, he should be able to accept and forgive other people's mistakes, even though that would not make up for what they had done. Until when they were all about to go home, Brett and his group appeared, and there Brett, who did not accept that a black man like Bullseye was more famous and labeled as a weapons expert, challenged Bullseye to a duel. However, Bullseye, who had repented, apologized and begged Brett to let them go. Even so, Brett, who did not care, still raised his gun when Bullseye showed the Holy Bible he always carried, until unexpectedly Brett shot Bullseye to death in front of Johnny and the residents. That is the reason Johnny is still eager to hunt Brett down to avenge his father's death. Moments later, while Johnny was fetching water, the horse he was riding collapsed due to the long journey. He was forced to continue his journey on foot, but after nearly 6 hours of walking, he couldn't take it anymore and fell unconscious. That afternoon, a reverend found Johnny lying unconscious and rushed to save him. When Johnny regained consciousness, the reverend named Percy lectured Johnny for straying too far from religion, because according to his experience, God always helps his servants in any way possible, and just like now, they were actually destined to meet each other. Percy, who knew that Johnny was a fugitive, then told Johnny to repent. Percy also added that he was on his way to Oklahoma because he would become a reverend at a small church there after the previous reverend suddenly died. When Percy was about to go to bed, he accidentally left a letter he had just written for an Oklahoma resident and the woman of his dreams, Bessie. Johnny, who was curious, read the contents of the letter and made Percy, who was annoyed, immediately hit him.
Feel we are destined to...
After that, Percy showed Johnny a photo of Bessie and said that she was the woman he would marry when he arrived in Oklahoma. The next day, when Percy and Johnny were about to continue their journey, suddenly several Indian robbers appeared, attacked them, and killed them. After Johnny left, an Indian approached him and realized that Percy was not dead because his arrow had stuck in the Holy Bible he was holding, and after that, they took Percy from there. Moments later, Percy woke up to find his face scribbled red by the chief's daughter standing beside him. It turned out that day was the day Percy was to be married to the chief's daughter, who had been single for a long time. Although Percy had already stated that it was all a misunderstanding, everyone there didn't understand what he was saying, and they will still continue the wedding ceremony. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Johnny, who found Percy's clothes, immediately shaved his beard so that his identity would not be revealed, and then changed his clothes. Sometime later, Johnny finally arrived in Oklahoma, and exhausted from his journey, he immediately entered a bar to rest. Seeing a stranger in the bar, a sheriff named Cove approached him and asked Johnny at length about what he was doing in their town. Remembering that he was a fugitive, Johnny said that he was Percy, a Reverend, who had previously been sent to the area. When Johnny was about to be asked further questions by Cove, Johnny, who saw Bessie's figure, immediately called her and said the words that were previously in the letter written by Percy. And that made Bessie, who did not know Percy's figure, assume that Johnny. With Bessie's statement, Johnny was taken by Bessie into the church. Surprise! There was tension there when Johnny was shocked and raised his gun. Luckily, Johnny was able to improvise and make the situation calm again.
Hallelujah! Hallelujah!
That night, Percy, who was constantly near the chief's daughter, prayed to God to help him. And not long after that, Percy's prayer was where when he heard a commotion outside, he found an Indian dressed as an animal lying unconscious due to being very drunk. Meanwhile, Johnny, who was chatting and talking with residents in a room provided by Bessie, received information from one of the residents that the previous Reverend had been killed by Tom's men so they could steal his possessions. Not only that, Tom also intended to take and seize the land in Oklahoma. Fortunately, the mayor of Oklahoma named Jesse was able to resolve the situation and save the residents of Oklahoma. Before leaving, Bessie announced that 5 congregants would be arriving and that the residents would hear Johnny preach in a few days. When everyone had left, Johnny, worried that his cover would be blown, intended to escape through the window. However, the church administrator suddenly arrived and handed over the key to the safe where the Oklahoma residents' treasures were stored. Hearing this, Johnny decided to stay a few more days because he now intended to rob all the money in the safe. The next morning, Percy, now dressed in the clothes of the drunk man in the night before, managed to escape and steal a goat belonging to the shepherds. Meanwhile, on the other side, Tom was furious at his 2 men because the Oklahoma residents were still insisting on defending their territory. Although Tom had previously received a letter of authority from the previous Reverend regarding the takeover of Oklahoma, it turned out that the letter of takeover, bearing the signature of the deceased Reverend, was a forgery that he had deliberately created. No wonder the residents were still insisting on defending their rights. Sometime later, Cove and his group arrived at Tom's residence to explain the truth, and before leaving, Cove threatened Tom to stop bothering the villagers. Even though there was tension between them, but Cove and his group, who had finished with their intentions, immediately rushed to leave that place. After they all left, Tom, who was not happy, immediately ordered his men to make a plan to kidnap Jesse. Not only that, he also ordered his men to hire the services of a weapons expert to lure Jesse out. A few hours later, Johnny, who had just finished cleaning himself, was approached by Bessie, who had prepared food for him. And not long after that, Johnny was surprised by Bob, who was making a mess outside the church. It turns out Bob did this to meet Jesse as per Tom's orders. Johnny, fed up with Cove and his group being scared just by Bob's presence, immediately taught him a lesson. While Johnny was explaining to the locals not to be afraid, Jesse and his wife suddenly arrived in a horse-drawn carriage. In front of the villagers, Jesse preached at length to the locals, telling them not to be cowards because God had given them hands and feet to fight for the truth. However, it turned out that the people who had just preached were not Jesse, but Jesse's younger brother and Bessie's older brother. Seeing Jesse's figure, Johnny's heart was moved as if he had fallen in love with her at first sight. Seeing Johnny's strange figure, because a priest carries a weapon, Jesse and the local residents asked Johnny to connect a verse from the Bible. When Johnny couldn't answer, the real Percy suddenly appeared in front of them and connected all the verses given to John. Percy, who knew that Johnny was impersonating him, immediately intended to beat him. Luckily, their identities were not known to the residents because Percy was finally made by the local residents, who thought Percy was crazy. Then Percy was taken to a room and interrogated by Johnny so that they could both benefit. Johnny invited Percy to work together, and he also apologized for previously thinking that Percy was dead. On that occasion, Johnny suggested that Percy pretend to be his because in a few days, with the safe key he had obtained, he planned to take all the money stored in the safe and run away. And after that, Percy could live freely and return to using his real identity. To ensure that Johnny wouldn't appear at the sermon, Johnny would pretend that he had suddenly lost his voice. In the end, due to the threat he had made, Percy was forced to agree and obey Johnny's orders. Sometime later, the injured Bob was brought before Tom and his men. There they examined the bullet that had lodged in Bob and finally concluded that Johnny was no ordinary person. Back to Johnny and Percy, who were now about to carry out Johnny's plan of pretending to lose it. It turned out that their plan succeeded in convincing the residents there, and because of that, the residents were willing to accept Percy as Johnny's assistant to replace him in preaching for a few days. Before that, Johnny introduced Percy as D. That night, when he was about to sleep, Johnny accidentally found a treasure map that the priest had made earlier in the inkwell in the room. And not wanting Percy to know, Johnny argued that what he found was just a normal message.
What is it? Nothing.
Curious about the treasure, Johnny quietly got out of his room and traced the direction indicated on the map. It turned out that the treasure that the priest had previously meant was an oil pump, which meant that the Oklahoma region contained petroleum that could be used by the residents to advance the region. Not long after that, Jesse, who was on patrol, suddenly spotted Johnny at that location. There, Johnny talked at length about what he had just discovered and said he would keep it a secret, especially from Tom's group. Seeing how Johnny cared about the residents, Jesse immediately took a liking to him. At the same time, Bessie, unable to resist her desire, immediately entered Johnny's room and assumed that the person sleeping there was because it was dark, and it seemed that Percy, who actually liked Bessie, did not mind. Then Johnny returned to his room and was surprised to smell an unusual perfume that Percy was wearing. Finally, Percy's sermon time arrived, and he seemed very excited, especially since he had been making out with Bessie the night before. Not long after Percy left, Bessie arrived and encouraged Johnny.
Until tonight, then.
When Johnny was about to get ready, Bessie suddenly thought that the person who had been making out with was Johnny and hugged Johnny, which made Johnny immediately run away. Johnny, who saw Bessie and smelled the traces of Bessie's perfume stuck to her clothes, concluded that last night Percy had been making out with Bessie and Percy was pretending to be him. Because he didn't want to be misunderstood, Johnny immediately approached Percy so that he would tell him the truth. Unfortunately, because of his emotions, Johnny accidentally shouted and made everyone there think that Johnny's voice had returned.
You don't have me looking like I'm... It's a miracle!
Reluctantly, Johnny, who didn't actually know any Bible verses, tried to recall his father's sermon from years ago. Unexpectedly, this method reminded Johnny of all the words his father had said at that time. As proof, Johnny, who had previously been able to easily remove the handcuffs, asked Cove to handcuff him, and with a few fragments of verses, he finally removed the handcuffs from his hands. After the sermon, Johnny is approached by Jesse and Bessie, who assume that he has played with their feelings. Although Johnny had explained at length, they both still did not believe and told him not to approach. On the other hand, Tom, who is fed up with Cove, then tells his men to hire the services of Brett's group. That night, to avoid any misunderstandings, Johnny approached Percy, who was currently very drunk at a bar. There, Johnny asked Percy to explain the truth about what had happened to Jesse and Bessie. Unfortunately, Percy, who was very drunk, couldn't process Johnny's words. Even as Johnny was about to leave, Percy accidentally angered a man nearby, causing a fight. Fortunately, the chaos was stopped by Cove, who immediately called Johnny to speak privately with him. At that opportunity, Cove, who already knew that Percy in front of him was Johnny, the most wanted fugitive, warned Johnny to testify. However, Johnny, who had repented and decided not to steal all of the priest's money, explained at length about the oil refinery he had found earlier, and promised that after that night he would leave the area because his cover had been blown. In return for Johnny revealing the secret about the oil refinery, Cove let Johnny go. However, unbeknownst to them, Brett, who had been hired by had overheard their conversation and immediately killed Cove on the spot. Due to this incident, the sheriffs there believed that Cove's death was caused by Johnny, who did not want his identity to be revealed, and therefore they all now intended to arrest Johnny. After handing the map to Jesse, Johnny left the area and said that everything he said was not entirely a lie, especially about his feelings for
I swear
Jesse.
you're the most beautiful thing I ever did see.
The next day, 2 of Tom's men were assigned by him to inform Jesse if Jesse did not hand over all the Oklahoma residents' property within 24 hours. He would not hesitate to send Brett's group and would pit the white residents against the black residents. At the church, the entire community finally realizes that the previous Reverend was Johnny, a notorious fugitive who has killed many people. Hearing this, Percy loudly tries to explain everything at length and tells the truth about who he really is and his relationship with. Not long after Jesse arrives and explains that Johnny's not entirely evil, he even hands over the treasure map he found earlier. With abundant oil in their area, Jesse promises that if the residents will work together to fight Tom's group, she will prosper the people of Oklahoma. In the middle of their conversation, 2 of Tom's men suddenly arrived and expressed their concerns. It turned out that they were secretly pro-Oklahoma society, and therefore, for the sake of the common welfare, these 2 men finally defected and decided to work together with Jesse and the residents. That night, the sheriffs finally found Johnny and dragged him away to be locked up in a prison cell before Johnny was to be executed the next day for killing Cove. As a friend, Percy visited Johnny and invited him to talk. There, Percy explained his life journey that led him to become a reverend. Before leaving, Percy handed Johnny the Bible he always carried with him and told him to read some of the verses he pointed out. Meanwhile, Jesse, who was sending a telegram, was suddenly kidnapped by Brett's group and brought before Tom. Sometime later, Johnny, who was reading the Bible as directed by Percy, secretly found a key to the cell inside. With this key, Johnny was finally free and dealt a few blows to the sheriff. After rendering the sheriffs helpless, he immediately fled to who, according to reports, was currently at Tom's residence. With the help of one of Tom's men who sided with him, Johnny was finally able to get Tom and all his men out of, and Johnny used the opportunity to free Jesse. Johnny swiftly killed all of Tom's men and leaving Tom alone to answer for all his crimes. After that, Johnny and Jesse rushed to Oklahoma and ordered the man in front to tie Tom up and bring him before the residents. Meanwhile, on the other side, Brett and his group arrived in Oklahoma and were stopped by the residents there. Brett, seeing this, naturally underestimated the small number of residents, and to intimidate them, he did not hesitate to kill a local resident who had dared to oppose him.
Whatever she was paying you?
Shortly after Johnny and Jesse finally arrived, and it was at that moment that Johnny handed over the bullet casing he always carried with him, as a reminder that Brett was the one who killed Johnny's father years ago. But unfortunately, since Johnny now wanted to live in peace, he allowed Brett and his group to leave before any bloodshed occurred. Until, not long after, because Brett persisted in disrupting Oklahoma territory, the Native Americans who had previously intended to execute Johnny and several others, including Cove, who was still alive, suddenly appeared. When Brett was alone, Johnny did the same thing his late father had done when confronting Brett. In the end, after defeating all her enemies, Jesse appoints Johnny as sheriff to protect and guard the Oklahoma territory, because their strength together with Johnny allowed different tribes and races to live together in harmony and mutually advance their territories. And the film ended.